Good morning, everyone, from the beautiful Blavatnik School of Government here in Oxford. I'm Chi Hung Sin, I'm Director at Traverse. It gives me great pleasure to be welcoming all of you. This conference just seems to be getting bigger and bigger every year. And it's really good that this year more people can attend in person, post-COVID restrictions being unwound. But let's not forget, we've got literally hundreds of people joining us online from their different time zones. So a very big welcome to one and all, wherever you are in the world. And as Andrea mentioned earlier, this is one of two sessions kicking off the two-day conference. So if there are any glitches at all, please just chill out. It's going to be informal. It's going to be fun. And if worse come to worse, ABBA will sing you a song. But let me start by positioning this roundtable, because this is the third one we've had at this conference series, right? And the reason why it came about was a few years ago, a few of us were really chatting amongst ourselves about needing to bring in different and new voices to the debate with different experiences, different practice as impact bonds have traveled around the world. It's really to help challenge some of those assumptions and orthodoxies that sometimes we don't even know we have. And I think in the process is to enrich that debate and discussion. And I think there are a couple of slides that really summarize some of the discussion points from the previous two roundtables on that. So if we can bring that up, yep, that's the one. So this is just to show you some of the topics that we've been talking about in the previous two roundtables. So the big ticket items, unsurprisingly, about innovation in reality or as an idea, about the difficulties in scaling and replication, in risk transfer, especially the value of private financing, etc., etc. Now, we will not be talking about those things today, even though I know they resonate with all my panelists and with many of you. It's not to say that they're unimportant. No, they are still important, but we would like to move the conversation and debate forwards, because those of us working in and around the field know how fast-paced and how fast-changing this is. So it's not because these things are no longer important. On the next slide, what you will see is a wonderful world map that's taken from data plug from GoLab's Indigo database that shows you why this topic about stretching and flexing of impact bonds remains of interest to us. So from its humble origins in the UK in 2010, impact bonds, social outcomes contracts have really started traveling around the world. And at last count in August, we have 251 bonds. And what's not on that slide is these can be found in 36 countries and counting. So as they've traveled, they have morphed. They look different. They play different functions. They involve different stakeholders. Does this matter? We don't know, but that's what we're here to find out. I think at this point, I'd like to bring in Elle Carter, Research Director at GoLab, to help us set the scene in terms of what do we mean when we say impact bonds stretching and flexing. Elle?
Thank you. So I'd love to take just 3 minutes to lay some foundations. What do we mean by impact bond or SIB stretchiness, and why might this matter? Our discussion, I think, will stretch in terms of both the form and in terms of the function. And a starting point, I suppose, what are we stretching here? I think many of us start with a quintessential or a textbook impact bond. This might be the assumption that we need to test and maybe need to challenge. But in previous research, we've talked about textbook impact bonds as having key ingredients or key dimensions that differentiate this model from other ways of funding social programs and services. So in this diagram, it's a little old, it's from 2018, but I still think it's relevant because the top 2 dimensions here are the key features in terms of the form of impact bonds that differentiate them from other models. So our first ingredient is paying for outcomes, an outcomes contract, or if you're being a purist, a robust impact evaluation that is linked to payment. So this is what marks the model as distinct to grants or fee for activity contracts. But as we stretch away from the kind of the pure impact payment, we may be looking a little bit different. So we've got flexibility and we know there's stretch. there. The second ingredient is independent and at-risk capital that's used to fund the service. So in the textbook, all of the capital comes from socially motivated investment. It's at risk. Service providers are completely insulated. This might be what marks impact bonds as distinct to more conventional payment by results models. But again, we know there's stretch here. So if these two top dimensions are about form, we can already trace this variation. So in a recent paper with my colleague Mara Iraldi and Christie Economy, we traced US and UK SIBs. We already see that this model is being broken and deviated from. A third potential ingredient to think about is the social intent of the provider organizations. So under the textbook, we're talking about charitable organizations where pro-social mission is formally enshrined in the legal form. The justification is that this opens up outcomes contracts to organizations that might otherwise not be able to participate. But again, perhaps not always the case. And the fourth ingredient, maybe a functional piece that comes through in the research, is around performance management. And operationally, we hear that outcomes contracts bring a real heightened attention to monitoring and managing performance. So each of these dimensions might be stretched away from the textbook, but we also see stretch in terms of the justifications that are used for impact bonds. So back in 2018, we talked about impact bonds as a tool for public service reform, potentially unlocking collaboration, more prevention, more innovation. But the impact bond tool is now used in a range of different contexts. I just wanted to say, finally, one word about stretch. Not just because it's satisfyingly visceral, a bit like chewing gum or plasticine, but I think it helps us unpack and consider the variation. We've got moldability and new shapes of impact bonds. And I think stretch and thinking about this enables us to learn and analyze some of the variation here. If we stretch too far, maybe it will break, or maybe we'll unlock new approaches. So I'm really excited to learn from our panel as we take more dimensions to understand stretch and lift this approach into very different contexts in response to new challenges.
Thank you, Elle. Thanks for that wonderful précis about how do we, what do we mean by impact bonds stretching, flexing, both conceptually and in practice. I can't even stretch to touch my toes, so this is going to be more than a stretch for me. So how, why, and to what effect? That's what we're here today to sink our teeth into. And I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today a wonderfully large but diverse set of panelists. Well, these conferences, as you know, are always uniquely bringing together the policymakers, the practitioners, the academics. We have all of those and then some, because we have selected speakers that work in high-income countries, middle-income countries, low-income countries. So how does that stretch look and play out? And we also have people working in very mature contexts for impact bonds like UK, Australia. We also have those who are quite new to the party, and we even have those who have yet to join the party. So this diversity of perspectives and experiences, we hope will really enrich that debate. So without further ado, I'd like to bring them in and let them introduce themselves. I might like to start with home turf in the UK, with two faces that will be very familiar to all of you because they're old timers at these gigs. Let me start with James Ronicle first, who is joining on screen, and then Neil Stanworth. James?
Thanks, Chi Hong. I think that's the first time I've been referred to as an old timer. Hopefully, hopefully the last time. I'm James Ronicle. I'm a director at Ecoris. We're a research and evaluation organization. We've been researching and evaluating SIBs for close to 10 years now, evaluated about 40 across 4 different continents. Nice to meet you all.
Thanks, James. Neil?
Hi, I'm Neil Stanworth, ATQ Consultants. We are a small but perfectly formed advisory firm advising on impact bonds and similar outcomes contracts, and also increasingly involved in the evaluation. We've worked with Ecoris on the project we'll be talking about today for 9 years now.
Thanks, Neil. James, old timers to be worn as a badge of honor. So from UK, we have a short hop over to the continent because, we're no longer part of Europe, apparently. So we're going to Europe, and where Jan Venema, stop me, hails from the Netherlands, and you've worked a lot on impact bonds across Europe. So
yeah, absolutely. So my name is Jan Venema. I lead Social Finance Netherlands. We're part of the wider social finance network that many of you will know. I have been in the impact bond space since 2013 when we launched our first impact bond in the Netherlands, and worked across Europe since, and are now working in different other jurisdictions throughout Europe, so not just only Netherlands, to see where are the markets that haven't joined the party yet, and what is appetite there, and what would be needed to really get things going. So we'll share about that.
Thank you. I think that comparative perspective is really, really important. Now we nudge a further bit upwards to Scandinavia, to Copenhagen, Denmark, where we have Mikkel Andersen joining us in person. Mikkel?
Hello, nice to meet you all. My name is Mikkel. I'm from Copenhagen Business School, and I'm doing a PhD about impact bonds in Denmark specifically. My research is primarily oriented toward the implementation, but also kind of the performance management side of social impact bonds. And I'm doing both longitudinal case studies, but also quantitative statistical analysis of kind of the outcomes and performance of impact bonds.
Thanks, Mikkel. Mikkel has actually done specific work on impact bond stretching. So I think, specializing on this topic, we're really looking forward to his insights. Still staying with Europe, we've got two speakers from Italy, Filippo Adari and Vincenzo Locasio. Filippo?
Hi, Filippo Adari, last Valley, I'm a co-founder and managing director. After 10 years working with government, civil society, I turned to the dark side, started working with big corporations, the tough one, developers, institutional investors. And what we do, we help them to drive the sustainability and innovation agenda in their business model, so core business. And so we use social impact bonds, social output contracts as a tool. So we are not the one fundamentalist about the thing, but we are very pragmatic. If it works, help the business to change the approach to social value creation in business, then we do it. And we'll share our example. I guess Vincenzo from the Ministry of Justice, if you're there.
Over to you, Vincenzo.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody. I honored to be here today. First of all, I greeting of the Minister of Justice, Marta Cartabia, and of Department of Penitentiary Administration, Carlo Renoldi. I'm head of Central Office for the work inclusion of the detained in the Department of Prison Administration. I'm promoting and coordinating several public-private initiatives in the penitentiary system, including Programma 2121, the project that has spread the social outcome contract initiative, the first in Italy for the work inclusion of prisoners.
Great, thank you, Vincenzo. Grazie mille. And Filippo, there's a darkness in all of us, kind of like Guinness, So from Europe, we now zoom out, and I'm really excited because it gives me great pleasure to introduce Daniel Greenways from UNESCO, who's about to join the party.
Yeah, hello, my name is Daniel Greenways. I'm a consultant for UNESCO. I work with the sports section under the sector of social and human sciences. And I think it deserves a little bit of context, why the sports section would be interested in this instrument in social outcomes contracting. When I came on the team last year, 2021, November, that was simultaneous with the launch of our new global alliance, which is called Fit for Life. And the goal of Fit for Life at a broader level is to enable sport authorities, especially member states, government sport authorities at the national level and at the local level, and especially in developing countries, to reduce inequalities between those countries, but also to reduce inequalities within those countries. And, using the broader framework of sustainable development. But we are here in a unique place, I think, on this panel in a sense, because for us, we are launching our very first SOCs. And we are engaged in this world because this, for us, is a way of empowering those ministers to realize the sustainable development goals that they are, in fact, funding when they're financing an implementation in sport for development, but is not necessarily always measured and is not necessarily always capitalized on. So it's about empowering the states. To take a change on what Filippo said, you know, we are also in a sense agnostic to the device, but we want to use it if it works to empower those member states specifically. So a different angle on the same thing.
Thank you, Daniel. I think it's really interesting to watch what UNESCO does with this agenda in the years to come. So at that transnational level, we now zoom back in to the African continent and someone that you would be familiar with, another stalwart of the conference, Celeste Brubaker and the wonderful Village Enterprise.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. Yes, so I'm the Chief Impact Officer at Village Enterprise. Village Enterprise is a service provider working to end extreme poverty in rural Africa. We do this by equipping first-time entrepreneurs with the skills and resources needed to start small businesses. Last year, we completed implementation of the first impact bond directly targeting poverty outcomes. We walked away from that experience very excited about the potential for improving outcomes when you tie payment to results. And so now we're working to scale up the use of SOCs for poverty alleviation, both within our own portfolio and for other like-minded organizations.
Great, thanks, Celeste. From Africa, we move to the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and it's wonderful that we've got colleagues from Abu Dhabi joining us again to share their impact bond journey. Shall I start with Shama Al-Jabeiri first from the Authority of Social Inclusion in Abu Dhabi?
Good morning. My name is Shama Al-Jabeiri from the Authority of Social Contribution in Abu Dhabi government. What we've been doing is actually trying to bridge the gap between the three main players, the government. We've been trying actually to highlight those social challenges and asking for the private sector contribution. And it's all need to be from the community to the community. It's a tough mission. It's not easy because it's the first kind, in the whole region actually. But it's very exciting and very interesting because finally we have a formal channels that the private sector can use in order to contribute positively in the community, but within using the incentive programs set by the government. So they feel that they are contributing positively and effectively rather than doing whatever they think it's important. We are using the SEB social and investment bond and the outcome based, believing that this is one of the tools that we could it could help us actually in our mission. We're testing, but it's because it's we believe that it's an innovative tool. So let's test it all together and see where it will take us.
Great, thank you, Shama. And now going online to Abu Dhabi. Actually, you're based in Dubai, aren't you, Nancy? Over to you to introduce yourself.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Chi. Hello, Shama and everyone. My name is Nancy Marab, and I'm an early childhood development expert working at the Abu Dhabi Early Childhood Authority, and we oversee the early childhood development sector in Abu Dhabi. And we are partners with Ma'an and Shama and the team actually to implement the first SIB that is related to early childhood development. And thank you, Dr. Chi, for inviting me to be with you here today. And I'm looking forward to such an exciting and fruitful discussions with fellow panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. And thirdly, we have Tim Bidey, who works with Abu Dhabi, but is based in London. Tim?
Yeah, this is around the world in 16 speakers, isn't it? So hello, everyone. My name's Tim. I have the good fortune of being a colleague of Ji Hung's. I think most people feel it that way. I am head of the voluntary community and social enterprise sector at Traverse, but today I'm here in the capacity of having worked alongside Shama and others on the evaluation of the social impact.
Thanks, Tim. So the Atma Social Impact Bond is the first in Abu Dhabi and the Gulf region. So a lot to share from that experience. From the Middle East, we now move to South Asia, and this woman needs no introduction. She's always fun, always full of energy, always insightful. Abathar Shah.
Good, after that. And also back from sabbatical, so refreshed, but perhaps brain slightly easier than normal because I've had such a good time. So good to be back in Oxford, so good to be back with colleagues and almost half the audience, I think, that I know. I'm Abha, I'm one of the directors of the British Asian Trust. Delivering social outcomes in South Asia is the work we do at the Trust. We're a nonprofit using impact bonds and whatever they call now, because people seem to have an issue with names all the time in the sector. Is one of the things that we do. I'm very excited today because we are closing one of our first impact bonds. You're launching it. You're talking about Abu Dhabi launching India's one of our biggest impact bonds, the $10 million quality education impact bond gets its results next week, and we have an excellent story to tell. So let's hope I can weave that together into some of our learnings and sort of match Village Enterprise in our enthusiasm of thinking about how the wider education sector can benefit from it.
Terrific. We look forward to those results and discussing them in further detail. From South Asia, we now cross oceans virtually to land down under with Samantha Reed and Miranda Lee. So Samantha first and then Miranda. Over to you guys.
Thanks, Chi Hong. Hi, everyone. As you know, my name's Samantha. We in the Ministry of Health are trialling 2 health-focused social impact bonds, one in mental health and one in palliative care. And we're in year 5 of those. They're both 7-year contracts. And I think those are both really good examples of how the impact bonds can stretch and flex across that spectrum that Dr. Carter spoke about as well. And so it's been a great opportunity for us to see both the differences that occur because of that flex, but also to really see some of the similarities that are emerging even across those differences as well. And so we work really closely with the Office of Social Impact Investment, who are overseeing the New South Wales government approach to impact investment as well. So I'll hand over to Miranda for a bit more on that.
Thanks, Sam, and hi, everyone. I'm Miranda, and I'm from Aussie, Office of Social Impact Investment at New South Wales Treasury in Australia. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land I'm meeting you from today, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So as Sam mentioned, Aussie partners with government agencies, the for-purpose and for-profit sectors to create long-term social impact. We've developed 10 investments to the market, delivered 10 investments to the market and 1 currently in development. So apart from the 2 health social impact investments Sam mentioned, the target policy areas include family preservation, reducing homelessness, recidivism, youth unemployment, and supporting young out-of-home care leavers to develop independence. So on the stretchiness spectrum Dr. Carter spoke about, the New South Wales SIs have a portion of fixed advance payments alongside the payments that are contingent upon achieving milestones and outcomes. Our portfolio has a mix of social impact bonds with private investor capital and payment by results contracts directly between government and the delivery partner who shares some risk. All the SIs have quite high social intent and strong performance management. And thanks very much for the opportunity to join this conversation.
Thanks, Miranda. Last but not least, we crossed the Pacific Ocean to end up in sunny California, USA. Hillary Olsen, over to you.
Yes, hi, I'm Hillary. I am a PhD candidate at the University of Southern California. And my dissertation research focuses on impact bonds from a variety of different perspectives. So the project that I'm talking about today is currently ongoing, so I'll be sharing some preliminary insights, but it focuses on impact bonds in developing countries and sort of looking at what are the motivations that stakeholders have for using these tools, other more traditional input-based tools. How do these impact bonds sort of align with broader social change objectives? So sort of looking at what are the theories of change underpinning the impact bonds in developing contexts. And so again, these are preliminary findings, so I look forward to sharing more in the future as well.
Thank you, Hilary. So there you have it, everyone, a full set of my speakers. And as Tim was saying earlier, around the world, not quite in 80 days, but just shy of 25 minutes. But let's get into the meat of today. So as I say, we're not going to be talking about everything. That would be spreading ourselves too thin. So we've settled on 3 hooks for conversations, and they're shown up there on the slide. And the first is really about recognizing any impact bond as both a project, but also has this boundary that interfaces with things and players outside of that project. So we would really like to shine a light on these different permutations, different levels of porosity of that project boundary to talk about the systems in and around impact bonds. So things to do with capacity, coordination, infrastructure, and then some. The second thing we're going to talk about, unsurprisingly, because this gets talked about at every conference, is data and performance management. And Elle, in your press say, you also mentioned about this. But our angle into the discussion today in this roundtable is really to start with an understanding of the differential motivations for data and performance management. It's not a singularity of motivations, and therefore the players, the functions, and the desired objectives can be quite different. What does that look like? And finally, the third hook for the conversation is this thing about shared purpose. We talk about this all the time, right? The impact bond model is supposed to align the incentives so that we all pull in the same direction. Is that enough? Is the model itself enough? Or do we need to do other things to actually establish and build that trust and shared purpose? So this is really drilling down into the aspects of how are people doing this? What are the dimensions you need to put in place? And what have been some of the findings, the learning about what works and what doesn't? So those are the 3 things we'll be talking about. Without further ado, let us dive straight into the first topic. And so this is, as I mentioned earlier, recognizing that there's that level of porosity between what happens in a project and the environment outside a project. I'd quite like maybe to start with James Ronicle first, because you and Neil have just published something that looks at the UK context, and you have come up with what you call a SIP hexagon as a way of looking at not just the dimensions, but also how that interaction leads to different forms and functions. So over to you, James, to talk us through your SIP hexagon.
Thank you very much, Chi-Hung. And as you correctly said, our aim here, Elle set the scene in terms of describing what a core SIB is and the idea that they could stretch and flex away from that. And that's exactly what we wanted to look at in depth within the UK in terms of what exactly is a core SIB and how in an objective and empirical way have SIBs aligned with that core SIB, or have they moved away from it, and why have they done that? And so we took the framework that Elle introduced earlier on, the 4 dimensions, and developed that into what you can see here on the slide, which is what we describe as the SIB hexagon. So this takes those 4 dimensions and tries to add definitions to it. So what for each of these, what does a core SIB look like? What might a stretch or flexed SIB look like? But we added a few more. So we took 1 around payment for outcomes and split that into 2 in terms of to what degree is this payment for outcomes versus payment for activities or other elements, but also the verification method. How are those outcomes verified and paid for? And then we added a 6th dimension, which was particularly relevant for the UK context, related to cashable savings, and to what degree are these SIBs based on the logic that the outcomes release savings that then pay for the payments. And then as I said, for each of these different dimensions, we then created a definition of what would a core SIB look like and what would different variations of that. So the idea is you can map a SIB against this, and the more it looks like a hexagon, the more it's a core SIB. And the different, if it looks different, it's because it's stretched and flexed. We use this for our evaluation of the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund, which is one of the first outcome funds in the UK and actually ever. And we are tracking 9 impact bonds in the UK within that evaluation. And so we mapped those 9 impact bonds against this framework. And if you move to the next slide, I'll show you what that looked like. So what you see here on this slide on the left is your average CBO SIB. So this is each of those 9 SIBs maps against those 6 different frameworks, dimensions. Remember what I said earlier, that the more this looks like a hexagon, the more it's a core SIB. And so what you can see is that within the UK, some elements of that core SIB concept have held relatively true. They are generally payments on outcomes. They generally do involve the voluntary sector in terms of delivery, and they generally do have additional performance management. Where they have stretched and flexed the most is the degree of, as Elle said in a purist way, the degree of the sort of rigor of outcome measurement. It's typically self-reported outcomes, usually no experimental approach to sort of estimate impact. And also, they're not really private sector investors taking on risk. They're usually a sharing of risk between philanthropic investors and delivery providers as well. But I think, and also the idea of them releasing cashable savings is they were all built on the notion of generating savings, but those savings are more hypothetical rather than really releasing cash that then pays for the outcomes. But the other important thing to stress, if you click a chart on the right should appear, is that they're all different. So this slide here on the right shows all 9 different impact bonds mapped against those different dimensions. And as you can see, whilst there's a nice clean average on the left, in reality, they're all completely different. So the point here to stress, I think, is that no 2 impact bonds look the same. They can be designed and operate in completely different ways. So a SIB is really an abstract concept rather than an actual thing. Why do they look different? Well, that was one of the things we tried to look at in our research. And really, there are sort of 3 key reasons. One is context. So people may have tried to establish and launch a core SIB and found they couldn't. So in terms of the outcome payment experimental approach, you can only really do an experimental type of evaluation in certain contexts, and that just wasn't possible. So there's been a sort of compromise on that core SIB, and they've been adapted to suit different contexts. Purpose. Some of these elements are seen by people as to be more important than others. So some elements have been dropped or compromised simply because they're not a priority. And the third reason is nobody knows. That people often, when you would ask them, why have you designed your SIB in this particular way? You know, there are other alternatives you could have used. They can't necessarily answer that question because often a SIB is taken from a different context and believed that that is what a SIB is. And therefore I will apply that same SIB here in my own context without really going through the process of why am I doing a SIB? What are my priorities? And therefore, how should it be designed? So I'll end there, but the key points we're trying to make here is that the SIBs look very different across very many different dimensions. They've been adapted and flexed in different ways, which overall I think is a good thing. But I think the thing to stress is that there really needs to be a process of going through that and thinking about why am I doing an impact bond? What am I trying to achieve? And then designing your impact bond to align to those objectives.
Thank you, James. Really precious words of wisdom there. And I really pick up on the third point. Your reason for why they change is because nobody knows. And I think that was a suspicion of many of us here, hence these kinds of roundtables, is to challenge those assumptions and orthodoxies. What you've just described there is things being replicated because of orthodoxies that we may not even be aware exist. And we simply replicate those models without necessarily thinking through why does it look this way? What are we trying to achieve? So I think that is a really, really important point that I hope we all, pay more attention to that, be more specific and explicit, and really develop and test those theories of change, which I think is still relatively underdeveloped in terms of what we're trying to talk about here. James, one of the things you didn't say, but I know came out in your report, is that you're not saying that if something looks like a hexagon or not means it's good or bad. There's no value judgment there. So I just think I put that qualifier out there in case people think we are judging whether it's a good or not SIP based on whether it looks like a hexagon. There's no value judgment there. But I think this is a really good visual model to help at least systematize some of that complexity that we're talking about, and that visual representation and how it varies then opens up really interesting discussion points for drilling down further. Now, the thing I'm going to do now, when I look at those dimensions, is this obviously came from the UK. I would really like to test how applicable or relevant this is, because we call this a core SIP model using James's language in the UK. But do other contexts look at SIP as having those dimensions that mean that they are core as a SIP in their context? I look at that axis that has to do with voluntary community sector organizations in particular. And I know I can think that there's so many, most of the SIPs in Japan do not have providers from the voluntary sector. They all have private sector providers. Some of them are very big private sector providers for profit making. On this note, Shama, can I come to you? Because I know the Atma social impact bond, the first in Abu Dhabi and the Gulf, you worked with a very big private sector provider, didn't you? So can you just talk us through what's your provider landscape like? And therefore, what are some of the implications for why you did things a certain way?
Thank you, Professor. I just want to also to start to mention that we test 3 SIP actually. The first one is Atma, that allow us to learn a lot. And we're going to launch Atma 2 very soon because of the good outcome that we reach. It wasn't really a safe or a pleasure trip, but we reach wherever we want. Recently, the beneficiary just graduated and get their job, which was exactly the focus of Atma 1. The 2 other SIP is actually, it's in other objectives, but also it's added to our lesson learned. Because of our experience in this 3 SIP, we are scaling up also. And we will be starting work on the outcome-based contracting. And we will be launching a new outcome fund to focus on a larger scope and dimension. Going back to your question, Professor, is about how was it and how we convinced the private sector to contribute and how we could find the right provider. Actually, it wasn't easy. So because the idea is about using SIP is trying to find the innovative way to deploy that project. The concept itself is new, but we try to find or to recruit the most relevant provider. Who could work actually in a good way with all the parties. So it wasn't like a tender or calling, but it was a selective, careful selection, and with the provider should have the appetite to go through that kind of experience and to be under that kind of test and pressure. So I'm talking about, for example, we reach out to an academy. And what they did actually is they tried to design a new model to deliver the project. It tested and discussed by all the parties, and then we start to launch it. We involved even some of the government academies in their delivery model. And yes, there was some of the mistakes all over the world because it's not the usual delivery model, but it was good. And I think we're going to keep doing that by trying to recruit the most relevant provider, because there is no like a direct or a specialized provider in what we do. We are here to invite everybody to our outcome fund. And please reach out to us if you are interested. And if you want to also to be part of that experience.
Thank you so much, Shama. I always love the way you upgrade me to professor.
I always call you professor.
I know you do. But I think that's really interesting because your point really reflects on how some contexts, the provider landscape is quite uneven, and you have to recognize who's actually on the radar, whether they can deliver to outcomes, whether they have the risk appetite to actually want to engage in these kinds of experiments where even if they don't have the financial risk, they could have a reputational risk, right? So choosing the right provider is so important. And also, I think in Abu Dhabi, I think your education provision tends to be largely private, isn't it? So I think hence the private sector provider makes sense as your key provider in Atma.
Abu Dhabi is a multinational, actually.
Yes.
We have a lot of nationality. We're lucky to have all of them. That's why our education system almost have all the curriculum from all over the world. We have the British, American, there also we have now the international diploma and so on. A big part of it, yes, it's a private providers, and the half of it is actually government, which they have their own curriculum. So what we're trying to do is try to find the right academy that could be the provider. We don't have a fixed framework in how to do that, but we're trying to develop it while we are working on it.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Shama. I think this point that you've just made about the capacity and the willingness of the landscape around you, I'd like to come at this point to Hillary as a bit of counterpoint, because we've started with a number of high-income countries, one of them in quite a mature context, one of them fairly new. From your experience, Hillary, how do these issues play out in lower middle-income countries that you work in terms of capacity, infrastructure for engagement, for coordination, etc.?
Thank you. Yes, so based on insights from interviews that I've done so far, I think there are a few ways that different stakeholders approach capacity building. So some of it could be service providers working with the local government to build capacity when they're trying to overcome implementation barriers or address service gaps. I've also seen some or heard some stories of outcome funders working with service providers in capacity building to sort of address bottlenecks in terms of helping them identify what are bottlenecks you're currently facing, maybe how could we design the impact bond to help you address these service gaps in new ways that maybe you haven't before. And then also heard about the big role that intermediaries play in terms of just providing really valuable expertise to the impact bond stakeholders themselves. In a lot of developing countries, they're still testing the impact bond model in new contexts, in new countries. And so the need for the outside expertise is really large. So I think the intermediaries helping build the capacities of the stakeholders themselves is very important. And I think there's also some capacity building going on as it relates to sort of some of the longer term objectives as well, which can vary from context to context. For example, there might be an impact bond where one of their longer term objectives is more related to building up the local private sector capacity in areas where maybe the government isn't envisioned to step into that role in the future, and where it's more to overcome some public sector limitations. And so in that instance, there could be higher levels of technical assistance to local businesses and private sector actors. And then, for instance, in another impact bond, it could be longer term objectives are more related to actually building up the capacity of the government itself and giving them sort of experience, institutional knowledge of how to implement impact bonds, how to implement other results-based financing. And so in that instance, it could really be, even if the government isn't an outcome funder necessarily, still engaging them in, monitoring and reporting and sharing learnings with them so that maybe they can implement impact bonds or other results-based financing in the future. So I think those are some different dimensions of capacity building. I also wanted to share that I thought it was interesting that a lot of the interviewees also talked about when you're taking a results-based approach versus an inputs-based approach, that there are a lot of cultural changes as well, a lot of organizational changes, and also just changes in the ways that, service providers, outcome funders and investors interact with each other that is different from before. And so I think there's also just a lot of internal organizational learning and capacity building as it relates to their abilities to then participate in future impact bonds, or again, other results-based or outcomes-based models in the future.
Excellent. Thank you, Hillary. It really strikes me, as I'm sure it strikes all of you, that each of these deserves a full-blown presentation in their own right. And I feel like I've shortchanged them by getting them on this roundtable. But in the networking sessions, please do pick up these deeper conversations with every single one of the speakers. I just want to reflect on something you said, because Hillary, what you said really resonated with what we discussed last year in terms of some of the foundation blocks for system strengthening to do with both the design and implementation of services and policy. So it's at the design and the implementation phase. And your 2 points about the longer term objectives for building up capacity either in provider sectors or the government, I think are really, really important points to illuminate, because I think they're valid even for high-income countries. Here in the UK, we're still grappling, right, Neil, about how do you build that capacity and retain that learning in government and in the provider sector. So I think those kinds of points are really, really important to remember. I'd like now to come online to Miranda first, if I may, because I know in New South Wales, Australia is obviously one of the earliest adopters of impact bonds. And you've done something recently in Australia that really takes a step back from all those projects that you've been implementing and really looking across and reviewing and gleaning the learning so that you can almost set a better, more conducive environment for these kinds of mechanisms and vehicles moving forward. Miranda, can I come to you just to talk us through what that review, what that learning has actually illustrated?
Yeah, thanks. So the New South Wales government launched its first SI policy in 2015, which aimed to establish and catalyse Australia's SI ecosystem. And we've recently launched the next iteration, so Policy 2.0, drawing upon learnings from the last 7 years delivering the 10 investments. And we're aiming to grow our impact by embedding innovation, prevention, partnerships, and an outcomes focus. And we have 3 main priorities over the next 3 years. So I'll probably draw some parallels to what some of our colleagues have just spoken about. So similar to Hillary's findings, we learned that an outcomes-focused culture is critical to SII. So one of our priorities is to enhance cross-sector capability to embed these principles of SII. We see that the joint development phase, that's the time where government works with delivery partners to structure and agree the terms of the investment as a learning exercise for all parties. So we really recognise the value that each party brings. And the spirit of learning which underpins SII spans how to improve both the particular program and also the commissioning of the services. So all of our SIs are evaluated and the evaluations are published on our website. And yeah, we're really grateful for opportunities like this roundtable to share and learn from insights in the community of practice. And another priority of ours is to strengthen and streamline our approach to deliver SIs. Our earliest ones were SIBs, social impact bonds, and we learned that the rigorous outcome payment metrics and the complex structures with private investors are better suited to more established programs. So we're adapting our approach for different stages of the innovation cycle, which echoes James's point around being cognizant of design choices. We've reduced the resource intensity for delivery partners by providing some training sessions, resources, templates, and we also conduct some data analysis upfront and share this with the market. For example, we developed the rate card, which lists the amount government's willing to pay for a specific list of outcomes to provide transparency, certainty in pricing, and reduce that negotiation timeframe. We aim to also continue providing this support and methods for developing investments at various stages of the innovation cycle to enable more diverse participation. This can include things like tailoring the evidence requirements to different stages and purposes, building flexibility into the SI to allow programs at an earlier stage of the innovation cycle to adapt their delivery. For example, including a review point with the ability to amend or extend depending on how the program's performed, and designing the financing structures that really fit the delivery partners and their programs. So we're seeking to better understand expectations, aims, and risk appetite of financing partners to consider when and how different types of financing, for example, private investors versus philanthropy, would be suitable. So we also learned that investing in programs that generate future savings to government can be challenging when SI funding comes from a single agency's budget, if a significant share of the government benefits accrue to other agencies or across jurisdictions. So one funding mechanism to bridge this is to allocate a central pool of funding for multiple SIs, such as our $30 million social impact outcomes fund, which was established last year to pilot a range of high impact programs. And the third priority is to build a broader, more diverse impact investing ecosystem, which includes fostering the growth of the New South Wales social enterprise sector, which could potentially help build a pipeline for future SIs. So that's just a brief overview of some of the learnings that have shaped Policy 2.0 and through which we aim to grow our impact beyond individual SIs and achieve better outcomes overall.
Thanks, Miranda. Samantha, any points to add on what Miranda just said there?
Look, just briefly, I think our two health social impact investments were the second and third ones out of the 11 that Miranda talked about that we've got in New South Wales at the moment. And so we were really quite early on in that learning phase, and we've contributed to a lot of these processes that Miranda's been talking about. But we are still continuing to learn throughout these investments as well and continuing to adapt. For both of them, we've actually adjusted the way that we measure the outcomes and how we pay for those outcomes based on what we're learning throughout the process as well, which I think is really valuable for us. And it's also contributing to our broader value-based healthcare strategies as well. So in that, we're always looking to enhance the ability to work in partnership and fund based on outcomes and impact and be able to measure those things as well. So it's not just about, SIBs contributing to learning about the next wave of SIBs. It's also about how this is contributing to the broader approach for us in terms of developing and funding healthcare as well.
Thank you, Samantha and Miranda. And I think that point is really important, that Australia obviously is using the SIB experience to open up avenues for other things. And you talk about what truly strikes me as an ecosystem approach. And I like your policy 2.0. I wish we have a policy 2.0 here in the UK where we actually crystallize some of that learning and actually revise some of the strategy and policies around that. I know France has been doing something similar. And I think if we could all, take a step back from running individual projects and actually using that to learn ecosystem lessons, we might do better projects in general beyond outcomes contracts and impact bonds. And I also like the point you made, I think it was Miranda, about really treating, especially the design phase, as a true collaboration where you lever in the different expertise. And I know that some of us here have been really championing that way of working, where the dynamics right now are still somewhat unbalanced sometimes in terms of the power. We're going for questions soon, but not before I bring in Abba, because this whole talk about system always makes me think of you, because you are a systems player. So from your experience, Abba, what are some of the things around this system strengthening piece and how it connects with projects or not that you've been finding out from the South Asia continent?
Sure, and I will talk about India because the depth, sure. That's what I will do. As I was reflecting on James, who always has the best analogies, hexagon. The one bit of the hexagon that you don't talk about, James, is the fact that the government is the payer of outcomes in your hexagon. Every social outcome contract in India doesn't have the government as an outcome payer. So let's put that on the table. Some of the biggest development impact bonds, government is not paying for outcomes. In other countries, multilaterals are underwriting capabilities of governments to pay. So those local governments in middle income countries are not paying for outcomes. So that is a really important point. It doesn't figure in the sort of UK piece because the assumption is you're talking about government all the while, and we're sitting in a government outcomes contract. So just really, really important. Now then why do it? If the central tenet of the SIB was It's making government deliver better outcomes. And we are running around developing these projects that doesn't have governments and saying that we want to influence them, saying we want to do it well. How are we doing it? And in India, I can be very honest, and I'm sure there are Indian colleagues around the table, the government's not coming on board to be an outcome player very soon either. So why do it at all? That's the question we're asking for this second generation of work that we're doing. So that's our top system strengthening question. It's not, let us go tell government to be an outcome payer. It's not that at all. It is, what's the good stuff that's come out of this for the sector that can then become the important conversation for us as practitioners? So what's the good thing that's come out? And this is all based on evidence from the Quality Education Impact Bond and other pieces of work that are in running or development. The first thing is it really works for our nonprofit partners. Those non-state actors who want to deliver impact, whether it's education, learning outcomes, skill development, and want to know what it costs, and want to use data to drive that, and want to do it at a different way. So let's say they've delivered in 5 villages, but want to take it to 50 villages at a better cost, from a village level to a cluster level. Those sorts of organizations love an impact bond because it allows them to play with cost dynamics very well. Clearly a good thing, because the innovation to deliver the kinds of ambition the government of India has for learning outcomes or skills for women sits within these organizations. So if we're doing it, we need to put them at the center of what we are doing in terms of our system strengthening and see what works for them. Then work for the people who want to fund them in an outcomes-based way to say, that is why we're doing it, with the intent that those organizations have the capabilities to take it to government, because government is partnering and procuring with them. I just want to make that one point. There are many more I can make, but very important to note the fact that government's not on the table with us as an outcome payer. We have an investor government, which is exciting and interesting and a different conversation, but this is the point from this.
That's absolutely brilliant. What did I say about ABBA? I think this reminder is really important because, again, you've challenged the assumption, haven't you? That we think this is what it looks like. These are some of the key players. And actually, this entity will always play this role across different contexts. And actually, those are just roles. They have no direct read across to any organizational affiliation. So a government doesn't have to be an outcomes payer. And actually, that sparks off a thought that in the UK, one of our SIBs, was it West London Zone? One of the outcomes payer is not a public body.
It's philanthropic investment.
Yeah.
Also, the Elton John AIDS Foundation is predominantly funded by the Elton John AIDS Foundation.
Yeah.
It has to be said, though, that that was not the intention when it was first designed. The intention was it would largely be government as outcomes payer. But it's a much more diverse set of outcomes payers as well. It's not just central government, of course, it's local government, it's health organizations, etc.
Yeah,
but there are a few that
There's a
break that
different
rule.
conversation to have about changing the way funding works across the ecosystem that we are also having in India.
Absolutely.
So that this is not just a tool for the way government buys outcomes, but the way everyone buys outcomes. And the global funding leaving India, that changes the conversation.
There could be an interesting conversation about why it is that way in the UK.
Yeah.
It's been the way it's been systematized in the UK has kind of made it very difficult for other people to
That's
become outcomes
absolutely
payers.
right. It's those orthodoxies that we were talking about earlier. I mean, in the UK, if nothing else, our language makes it worse. Rather than calling them outcomes payers, we always say commissioners.
Indeed.
And commissioners equals public body. But actually, the role is that of an outcome payer. It's not a commissioner role, essentially. It's an outcome payment role. We could go on till the cows come home, but I'd like at this point just to pause it to bring in some questions from the audience, both online and in person. Andrea, how do we play?
2 questions lined up. Great news, we're actually ahead of schedule. Thanks for
Don't jinx it by saying it.
So we have time for a couple of questions. And I promise we will try to alternate between online and in person, although I do realize that a lot of you in the room are actually on Zoom, so I might accidentally come to someone in person. But Dr. Asif asked a question online. He's actually happy to unmute himself and ask the question live. So Dr. Asif, if you can hear us, you unmute yourself.
Yeah, I can hear you. Thank you very much. So happy to join you. And it's a great learning and a great event indeed. And it's a nice experience. So my question to you, I mean, don't you reckon, while we are talking about social impact investment, while we are talking about impact bonds, prior doing so, we need to really think about the core values. how to connect with the core values at the national level, societal level, and even at the corporate level. Because, you know, even in this G20 Indonesian presidency time, I had the privilege recently to participate in one of the developing working group, and we voiced out that we need to connect even the policy making and procedures ultimately by the G20 leaders or even the world leaders by considering the core values. We need to have the value connector. So my question to the panel is, don't you reckon once we are thinking about social impact investment or social impact bondings, it's better to connect a little bit to go one step back and making our root more powerful and strong by connecting with the core values at the national, societal, as well as corporate level? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Azif. Right, who amongst my panel would like to take this question? Actually, Sharma, can I direct that to you? Because I think this connection with the wider core values that I know in Abu Dhabi, there's a very clear national strategic framework, isn't there, for how you prioritize the different social issues that you tackle, who works on them. Could you talk us through what Dr. Azif was talking about there, about connecting projects to a wider core purpose?
Yes, Abu Dhabi focus a lot on the social development, and they even have a strategy for the upcoming 5 years and how to do that. They work a lot on the restructure of the social sector from government aspects in order to enable the delivery of those social objectives, which involve a lot of transformation for the service, for the well-being, lifestyle, a lot of, around that. I guess that's exactly why they created the Authority of Social and Social Contribution, is actually to help them to come up with an innovative model to reach that goals by encouraging all the parties to participate and to contribute to that. It's a risky model, but I think that one of the things that it helps us to put everybody in the same table. For the private sector, they could do different contribution. They could be financially contribute, and this is taking the box for their CSR. They could also be a provider where they could, showcase their capability, which definitely will be impacting them positively on their repetition and stretching their capability too, which is going to be a learning curve for them. For commissioner, they also could be a good evaluator, but not necessarily be a government entity. So that's exactly where we could also plan to build up a capability. Government, finally, there's somebody sharing the risk with them and not the one who only deliver the projects. We use for the last 50 years is the government are the only body who will be responsible to deliver the projects. Now we're trying to involve the other parties who actually, I call them beneficiary. So outcome pair shouldn't really be the only one. They could be the one who be actually be beneficiary out of that outcome. There could be the private sector who will be benefit out of a good scales of employers, because it's very expensive in our market. It could be the education system by having a better, for example, a curriculum or a model. So that's how we are promoting it for the different parties, is to find what's up. We always start to think about what are the interests of them and how we could meet that interest. This is how we try to do it actually in Abu Dhabi.
Thanks, Sharma.
We're still learning.
And I think you alluded there to like a collective impact way of looking at this, and that links to some of the core values stated for the Emirates. On this note, Celeste, can I bring you in? Because I'm always interested to compare how it works in some of the lower middle income countries, especially when Abba has already talked about this, sometimes this split between what government does, what government drives, and some of the gaps at the ecosystem level. So from your experience in Africa, how do you look at this issue of connecting projects with a wider core set of values?
Yeah, so I've definitely seen it vary in my experience in Africa. I think one of the issues in sub-Saharan Africa actually is that there can be this divergence between agendas from international philanthropists and international bilaterals and the governments representing people within their own countries. I actually see social outcomes contracts designed in partnership with governments is one way to start to solve this issue. Because even if the government is not the commissioner of the outcomes evaluation, at least the government having a say in which outcomes would be prioritized, I think can really help to tighten that alignment.
Thank you so much. Andrea, who else do we have?
Yes, we have a question from Professor Gavin Holmway.
I'll be able to take care of one of them line, this is not mine too, but I thought maybe Celeste or someone else who just might be able to help out. So if you have a nation state like Haiti, where the national government is currently essentially no longer functioning, but local area governments actually are still taxed, but they're getting nothing in return. So there are some local NGOs who want to help the local government build capacity. They're very isolated, they're usually in specific areas. How can they get connected with social investors or entities, maybe like Celeste, that are helping to fund? I don't know if a social impact fund itself would be realistic in those settings, but to have that kind of financing to build local capacity where you don't have a functioning national government.
Thanks, Caroline. Could I invite Hillary to come in first and maybe Abba? Hillary?
Yes. So I think there were some examples from people that I talked with where there was a lot of difficulty in finding investors, even in finding service providers. And so a lot of the discussion, I think, is not everybody is ready for an impact bond, and there does have to be a lot of work to get to that stage to be, I guess, investment ready. But I think a lot of it was just finding the right partners in terms of impact investors, finding people who were willing to have sort of the below market interest rates and very strong social values. It was hard going for some, this is just based on anecdotes. This isn't, and the purpose of this panel is all of them are different, but instead of going for bigger, corporate investors or going for even maybe charities, that it really had to be a social investor that was willing to take the risk but had very strong social values. So I think it's sort of identifying who those players might be in that area, but then also finding which service providers might be willing and ready for sort of that cultural change. Because I think some of the interviewees were saying that they tried it and they were kind of surprised by how challenging it was adapting to this new way of working. So I think just maybe setting expectations partly, and then just really a lot of work on finding the right partners. And it sounded like, again, intermediaries can play a very big role in that sort of matchmaking. But yeah, it sounds like it can be very difficult.
Thanks, Hillary. Abba?
I'll add 3 questions you should ask yourself. What's the problem? Is it urgent? How long do you have to solve it? How much is the problem going to solve? How much is it going to cost? And whether whether grant can do the work quickly or not. So for me, grant is always king. If there's an urgent, important problem and it can't be solved, it needs to be solved quickly. Don't turn to an impact bond. It takes time. If you want an impact bond to solve it, build mechanisms for service provider capacity building. We're doing something with Bridges where we have a runway year, which is building the capacity of the service providers, enabling us to solve the contracting in the background, enabling service providers to be selected and done. So think about the timing, think about how much it's going to cost. Remember, you have to pay investors. Is it worth it in that problem? And in those crises, use grant when you can, because that is the best mechanism. You need to think about whether that problem's gestation needs an impact bond. If it's going to take 1 year to sort out, is the problem.
Excellent responses. I think it's that reiteration of the point about always start with the problem we're trying to solve, not really about the solution that we go looking for a problem to solve.
I
Andrea?
think we've got time for one more question, and I know there's someone who'd like to. Thank you. I just want to share our experience in Colombia and perhaps ask for your help because we're facing kind of a challenge.
Could you say your name, please?
My name is Maria Gomez. So in Colombia, we've been working in developing 4 social impact funds now, and one really kind of big contract-based result. We started 5 years ago with one SIP. It was $500,000 perhaps. Then now we have 4, rounding up to $9 million with great results in employment specifically. And now we have a local government developing a contract-based result on their own. So we're kind of like having a good grade on our main purpose, which was changing the mindset of the government, local and national, trying to move towards paying only for results. But now we are facing a great challenge on the market development because we don't have enough services to absorb all the resources the government is willing to pay. You mentioned, Hillary, just 3 seconds ago, how we have to do this matchmaking and try to place the correct incentives in the contracts. But still, we are facing that. Doesn't matter if they're non-profit or private, because we're looking for both, right? Big, small, medium. We just can find the way yet to work on their mindset change on the private sector. Any thoughts on that?
I think just quickly from my perspective, because I partly deliver something here called the Commissioning Academy, where we train commissioners in different forms of commissioning. And what we've always said for decades is that for UK public bodies, local government, we are good at market engagement. We're not good at market development. So we don't look at commissioning tools and levers as a way of growing market capacity, growing the types of providers we want. We just purely engage with what and who is already there in the market. So that's just my personal reflections. Could I perhaps bring beyond to reflect on what does it look like in Europe, this comparative picture you see? Any solutions for what Maria was talking about?
No, I mean, I in essence, it's like Maria was saying, I think it's very exciting that local authorities now picking this up. It's interesting that in a very pragmatic way, our experience has been that if there's outcome payers that are willing to pay for outcomes, the service providers will come, because if there's money, they will come at some point. And the question is, do they have the right capacities? Are they capable of delivering through those outcomes? Do they have the capacity in the organization to provide the right data, to work in those structures? I think that's where the challenges lie. I think it's been challenging to show government, and in my experience, I think that goes across, is that you're spending all this time to convince them to pay for outcomes and that this is something that is interesting from their perspective. But actually, especially in early stages of the market, we see that as important that they're starting to think about paying for outcomes or using different structures, is that they're willing to provide funding or grant funding, or that is right for capacity building, and really builds that market. And that's just a way of, outcomes funding is something that's new for them. But I think providing capacity building is new for them as well. And sometimes that we've seen that's scary, because then you're spending this funding that is not going through the programs, but is going through organization development. And how does that then play into a role? So we've seen some philanthropy funders coming in saying, look, if the outcome payer is willing to pay for the outcomes, why don't we top up some of that funding so that these service providers are capable of building capacity either at the same time as tapping into that outcome funding, or in a period before that, and trying to develop the structure and all of that. And I think that looking for those maybe additional funders that would be able to support that would be my suggestion.
And I'll add to that. I agree. We have an outcome readiness project in India with a philanthropic funder called Tata Trust, one of the biggest in the country. And my colleague Shree's here, who could give you all the details about how that project is rolling in the readiness piece. We think it's one of our most exciting pieces of work, because you are right that when there is money, then there's culture fit, then there's need for all kinds of capacity building, the cost of the investment goes up, and we need to sort that end of the problem out as well. And there's some good case examples, case studies, toolkits from India we are very happy to share.
Could I maybe come quickly to Miranda or Samantha, because does your policy 2.0 touch on anything to do with market development?
Yeah, so I think we do try to kind of weave the capacity building in all of our activities. So when we're, for example, releasing a tender for a specific opportunity for impact investment, we would try to weave that in the materials that we release in terms of giving some guidance. Just we're cognizant that proponents may not be familiar with outcomes-based contracts or any of the social impact investment principles. So just giving some information that might be easy to understand and just increase the access and diversity of the participants in the market.
Thank you.
I think from a practical perspective, that capacity building is probably something that we underestimated early on, the need for it. And it's certainly something, particularly in the providers, in terms of really understanding the difference between a regular contract and an outcomes-based contract and what that means in how they approach things as well. Really important to be something that we continually invest in upfront, but really keep on checking in throughout the period of the investment as well, I think.
Thank you very much. Maria, in the UK example, we support capacity building through both money, like grants, to support people to do things, but we also provide technical assistance in terms of capacity building. So the current live outcomes funds and the refugees transitions outcomes funds by the Home Office, there is a specific piece of support that is targeted at the market of providers to build up the capacity to understand and to engage with that. So I hope that in the round answers some of your questions, but do pick it up in the networking.
Thank you.
Right, I think that's all the time we have before we start eating into the time for segment 2, which is data performance management. Gosh, it's like running a marathon. I'm actually feeling hot here. It's the light. I just want to pick up that point that we just left off with, which is, system capability, infrastructure gap. But turning it to the specific focus of data performance management, because I know that it's equally played out when it comes to data performance management. I'm going to come to you to begin with, Celeste, because again, you work across a number of geographies in Africa. And in your introduction, you talked about finishing your pilot and now in the scaling up stage. So to me, that strikes me as having a number of issues in terms of data performance management at both the pilot stage and the scaling up stage. Could you just talk us through how data plays out, the issue of data?
Sure, yeah. And so in the space of outcomes projects, I find it helpful to think about data in terms of 2 categories. So the first category is data for external accountability. So data that helps us understand if indeed we are achieving the outcomes we've set out to achieve and will be paid by the outcome funder. And the second category of data is data for project management, data that helps us understand, are we implementing activities? Is we intend to implement them? And is that helping to lead us towards the intended results? What I've seen, what I think is mostly true, is that strong internal data systems lead to higher performance. And I also believe that that a trend we've seen across the space is that when we tie payments to outcomes, that seems to incentivize organizations to improve their data systems. So from the perspective of thinking about how can we effectively scale impactful programming, this makes me think that that contracting with social outcomes contracts could be a fantastic way to support scaling of impactful programming. However, we in the social outcomes space are still evaluating projects on a project-by-project basis. And this actually introduces barriers for effectively scaling impact from my perspective. Most notably that it can be difficult to compare outcomes across projects, even projects that include value for money analysis. And this makes it difficult for funders to compare projects and to compare implementers and to decide where can I have the most impact for the money that I spend. I think that there's been some progress to date on data portals that aggregate data, that share the data, and that even make comparisons to try to help out in this space. I think this is a great start, but I also think that there's important nuances in how evaluations are conducted that can become masked with these types of portals and comparisons. And so I think this is a great start, but I also think it's just part of the solution, and that we also need to make more progress in terms of establishing some measurement standards for verification of social outcomes to kind of tackle the issue from the front as well. I want to back up though and also discuss the concept of commissioning evaluations for projects on a project-by-project basis. I recently received a piece of clothing in the mail, and it came with a little certificate that told me that my purchase was delivered to me completely carbon neutral. And this was possible because the company was able to purchase carbon credits through an organization that was essentially an evaluator of carbon outcomes working across countries globally. So that's the E in ESG, and I have to ask myself, okay, so what are the barriers? Why can we do this for the S in ESG? I think there's many barriers, but certainly the lack of quality data, especially in low and middle income countries, is a large barrier. Historically, given the lack of quality data in low and middle income countries and the prohibitively high costs of collecting data, especially via traditional in-person methods, it makes a lot of sense that we would have a tradition of commissioning evaluations and data collection on a project-by-project basis. But I also think that we're seeing a lot of innovations in technologies and new possibilities for constructing data sets in new ways. So for example, there's been advances in using machine learning and satellite imagery to conduct data sets that can be actually quite powerful for looking at economic outcomes. And so this is something that I think we as a sector could really benefit from continuing to explore further, how we can construct data sets using alternative data sources. And I think that this is something that, that ultimately will help us overcome some of the barriers to evaluating projects, including the high costs of in-person data collection, but also issues like when data can't be collected at all in person, like during conflict or during the COVID-19 lockdowns that delayed the impact evaluation of our project by over a year. And I think ultimately making progress here is something that will then allow us to, will help us move forward in terms of being able to evaluate across projects and hopefully really scale the use of social outcomes contracts.
Thanks, Celeste. I like the attention you paid to not just the data in projects or relating to projects, but actually there is a wraparound in terms of the infrastructure that needs to break down that friction of a project by project way of doing things that really adds to cost, you know, the lack of comparison, and it really has a barrier to replication. And you also mentioned evaluation, which reminds me to bring in Tim, who is evaluating the Abu Dhabi SIB. Can you talk us through some of the data issues? Particularly, I think Abu Dhabi is collecting quite a creative range of data around the impact bonds, aren't they? Tim?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it feeds into today's topic. So we're talking about stretching SIBs, but I think there's also an element of stretching ourselves when it comes to these topics. When you have an instrument and can have as many moving parts as a SIB does, the tendency can be to kind of focus on what's in front of you, what you're beholden to almost, and actually forget about just the messiness of the world that we work in, and how actually beyond those changes that you're focused on, there's likely to be ripples that are going to come from that. And I think this is where what we've seen in Abu Dhabi really works, where from the start of the program, there's that acknowledgement of not just those payment triggers, but actually thinking about what happens outside of those. What are the other potential areas that those changes might ripple into? And that's really important, because if we're to understand the true value of the work that's being done, we can't just have that kind of lens on one piece of the puzzle. And in addition to that, if we're to look to kind of bring more people into this sphere, then I think there's that imperative to kind of speak to all of those different changes that are being created. You know, payment triggers serve a really specific purpose within a SIP, and because of that, they're clearly defined, they're clearly measurable, they can be simple, and they don't account for that complexity. They don't account for that messiness and all the different spaces that one change spills into when it ripples out. So give ATMA as an example. If you look at the payment triggers alone, you would say this is an education and employment program. Your payment triggers are focused on individuals completing learning modules, individuals completing work placements, individuals entering into employment. But at the start of ATMA, there was that acknowledgement of actually what's happening here it's not just an education and employment program. There's likely to be other outcomes that come from that. And when you look at the theory of change, when you look at the evaluation and you begin to kind of unpack that rich qualitative data, lo and behold, we see kind of quality of life changes for individuals. We see knock-on effects for their families and well-being changes in families. The employment places that those disabled people go into, we see more inclusive policies, we see attitudinal changes in people that are working alongside of them. And when you look at it that way, suddenly it's far more than an employment program. The scale of impact is actually astonishing. And you would miss it if you just kind of focused on those payment triggers. And so that's why I think it's really important for that imperative to keep pushing ourselves, to keep looking broad in the way that the ATMA team have done, rather than just focusing on that one bit of the journey.
Excellent. Well, this issue of complexity and messiness, Daniel, when it comes to UNESCO, trying to do that at a transnational level, where do you begin? What are your aspirations? What will you be doing?
Well, I'm glad that, Tim, you mentioned the complexity of the outcomes that you can derive from a single project, because in terms of our work in this area, it really began with an understanding of that complexity and an understanding that wasn't being translated into the way that procurement and funding was taking place. The section I work for, as I mentioned at the beginning, is the sports section of UNESCO. And sport is a very interesting, let's say, funding challenge in a sense, because on the one hand, you have incredible outcomes that come from grassroots level sport participation, and you have a potential in sport investment to make a change as it relates to sustainable development. But the way that sport funding is allocated right now is generally allocated on the basis of performance. So you have elite sports being the primary component of that, and you have performance being the centerpiece of what the sport ministry has allocated a budget on the basis of. That is an inhibiting factor for our work as we are concerned with sustainable development and also with supporting sport ministers to be empowered to capture their aspect of that national development agenda. And so our journey in this began with a data set that really showed the business case for sport investment. That was a data set built by UEFA. It's still being built today, and it's a very impressive data set. And it shows the social return on investment of amateur football participation primarily, now other sports as well. And when we saw that, we said, finally, a tool that shows what we have known all along, but concretely in terms of the dollar value for this kind of investment. So we have known for a long time, when you invest in grassroots sport, what you're really investing in is preventative healthcare, you're investing in education, you're investing in inclusion, you're investing in empowerment for youth, you're investing in crime reduction, and many other factors as well. But the dollar value as it's associated with that at a return on investment level was never clarified. And when UNESCO and our member states passed the Kazan Action Plan a few years ago, and then more recently when we launched Fit for Life, one of the primary and central core goals of that was we need data. We need data to show the connection between that investment that is being made at the ministerial level and what the outcomes are for it. But as you say, in this nuanced way where there's complexity to it, where the performance metric, which is the primary metric, is not actually the metric that might be the most profitable. And the UEFA model showed $39.5 billion euros, annually of value in football, amateur football alone across Europe, now a greater number than that. And it's numbers like this will exist across any sort of grassroots football or grassroots sport implementation rather. And so from that, then where do we go with that? What is our goal long-term? Because we're newcomers here, we're just at the beginning of this journey. Our goal is to create international data sets, which dovetails well with some of the goals that I've heard here on the panel. And it also dovetails really well with what we hear from SOC organizations, intermediaries who we've spoken to, is that in order to build government support and in order to get these contracts up to scale, there needs to be less startup costs, there needs to be international data sets that are applicable and are robust and are transferable between different implementations. But then there also needs to be that government support, which is maybe the other half, let's say, of why UNESCO would be involved in this. And so we're piloting projects in order to start building that data, but also to learn from doing, as Ji-Hung often says to us when we speak to him. Learn from doing, because this is a proposition that even if you are in a developing country where there is not necessarily the data sets existing, maybe there's a data gap, maybe there's a data silo because the data is owned by a private organization, you can build that data from actually running an SOC. And so those system level, those long-term goals should include a guide to how to make those SOCs and a basic data set. And when it comes to stretching and flexing, I'll finish by coming back to the theme. What we might say is that we're trying to learn today and going forward where the essential components of an SOC are, especially in terms of that data component, what is essential for a very transferable and robust data set. And then to touch on what Celeste said, what do you need to make sure is always developed locally in order to make sure that there retains that kind of nuance that will make these programs successful. So that balance, finding that balance, and then for the data that you can build internationally, I would assume health data is going to be a big one for us in terms of sport investment. Those are concrete data points that would be applicable to any implementation that has participation metrics, but also education data, and also youth empowerment data and inclusion data. And then what do you need to build locally in each one, and building a guidebook for a government, for a practitioner to go to the ground and say, okay, we want to do an SOC. This is what we need minimally to build locally. And then here's these international resources, which are getting better and better each year, but that are going to help support the rate card, are going to help support understanding what the value of this investment is. So it's an advocacy tool, and it also, of course, it's a practical tool for creating a contract. So that's a little bit of a foreshadowing. I hope in a few years I come back, we come back, we say, this worked, this didn't, this worked, this didn't. We had a great experience with it, and now we're moving to this so that we can start to expand it and with new partners, with new scale. So a little bit of foreshadowing on that.
Thanks, Daniel. You will come back. So what's the minimum viable product and what do you need to build on top of the MVP? I think these issues about open data, data standards, you really need to hook up with Ella and a team here at the GoLab, because that's what the GoLab is here to do for the UK, and certainly wanting to link up to some of these international developments. You mentioned the data set from UEFA. I know there's someone from UEFA here in the audience. Rupert, can you put your hands up so that people can come and bombard you during coffee to ask you about this data set? So that's Rupert Webster from UEFA, intimately involved in this project around the data set. You're very welcome. So we can't talk about data without talking about performance management, and different speakers have already dipped into that. Mikkel, I know you've done a huge amount of work in this area. Could I trouble you just to talk us through, from your experience, especially the comparative angle, about what are some of the costs and benefits involved in how people go about this performance management?
Let me tell you very briefly about the context as well, because I think it's quite different from the talk so far. So I'm investigating a project in Denmark. It's a mental health intervention that has existed for about 10 years and is basically embedded within a research project. It started as a research project, a collaboration with Harvard University, and then it became kind of a program and intervention after that. And I think that explains why it is an impact fund today, basically, like this historical. So first of all, this program is kind of, it's a mental health intervention that is, the sole purpose of it is kind of to reduce stress, and that was the intention. From the beginning, there was a variety of different indicators, different metrics around what to measure, not only stress as a clinical measurement, but also anxiety, depression, sleep deprivation, the perception of the ability to function at a workplace, for example. And those different metrics made it much more easy years later to have a discussion about the potential to create some kind of outcome metrics around an impact model. Secondly, I think one of the things that worked very, very well was the type of metric they used to measure. So basically, they used a clinical metric around stress, called the stress scale, and that metric was basically used and referred to by all municipalities of Denmark and the health authorities. So in that way, it made it much more easy to talk about how to scale the effort and how to use the same kind of financial structure and have the same contract model in other municipalities. And kind of that's a kind of related discussion about transaction costs and how to kind of use these structures. And thirdly, I think just the intense focus on collecting data and kind of getting respondents to actually answer the surveys that they sent out really kind of made a high quality of data that you could see that the stakeholders really appreciated, and you could see that well, essentially the program is much more expensive than other mental health services, but the municipalities saw value in the data and that really made a difference. And I think those kind of three things made it much more feasible to become a social impact. It's still being delivered through traditional process, but it's also being delivered through an impact. So when there's been a lot of discussion and work around how to develop it into an impact fund, and it took a lot of time to do that. And there also arose some challenges in how to construct a performance management system around it. And I think that refers to the original discussions that we had early on here about kind of the prototypical, the ideal model, impact fund model. So essentially the mental health program, kind of the business case relies around the employment effects, or the expected employment effects of the mental health intervention, because stress, mental health is not something that the municipalities pay for. We know that it's related to a lot of things that that kind of pushes the budgets, municipal budgets, but not mental health itself. So how do you kind of create a business case around this and a contract around this? So basically, we are trying to kind of translate the mental health program into a combined kind of mental health and employment program. And how do you kind of see this? Well, first of all, I think there was some discussions about, like, we know that there is a very strong correlation between kind of stress levels and the ability to work and to function in the workplace. Also the sick days that you have, the ability to enter the job market, but also the ability to kind of be at a job. So there is kind of a thing there, but we don't know specifically how this program kind of relates to this and where the effect is. So I think from the investor's point of perspective, this was a high uncertainty, and therefore there was kind of some points made to, if we were to include an outcome metric, this could kind of change the uncertainty and the risk profile of the case. And until that is done, there's kind of a different risk profile from that perspective. Another thing was just the basic, I think, you also touched upon it earlier, kind of the system perspective, because when you include a focus on employment, you also include another department within a public organization. You don't not only work with one department, but you work with another one. And it's not predictable how municipalities are organized in Denmark. Like, one municipality does not look like another one. It could be that one municipality has a close collaboration between the preventive health service and kind of the job center, because there is in reality kind of a correlation between these things, but it's not necessarily. This is politically decided, and it's totally arbitrary, like how these are organized. So when you talk about how to actually make an operational model that thinks about these two departments and how to collaborate with it, there's a clash there, because it increases kind of the complexity in that sense. So that was also a struggle. So I think there's kind of that different challenges.
Sure. Thank you very much. I think you almost have a natural experiment going on where you use a lot of consistent data that, Celeste, you don't have, but actually you have a different set of challenges when you're trying to scale up. And it really points to, both the technical and the relational. And this is both an art and a science. It's not easy. Very quickly, can I come to Nancy next? Because I think you are embarking on this journey with the second or the third impact bond in Abu Dhabi, where data plays quite a unique role in your relationship and partnership building. Nancy?
Thank you, Dr. Chi. Actually, before I answer your question, I'm reflecting a little bit back to what fellow panelists have been talking about, some success in building some data sets, data systems, and mechanisms, and so on. So this made me actually think about how this relationship between data within a SIB mechanism could work. Although data drives facts, it's actually the collaboration that generates value. And this is exactly our experience in Abu Dhabi currently. So our SIB is, as I mentioned, is the first early childhood development SIB in the whole region. And it provides counseling support for parents who are going through divorce and who have children that are aged between 0 and 8. So when we started thinking about the design of this program, all concerned stakeholders wanted to address the challenges that these children and their parents face whenever they are in a divorce situation. But what challenges exactly? And so can you even think about how complex divorce is? So think about the sensitivity of the issue in our context, similar to other countries in the region. Think about the legal procedures. Think about the emotional turmoil that children face whenever they are in this situation. Think about what the mental health actually and the mental states of their parents. So there are too many elements in this context, and this requires collaboration from several partners and perspectives. And opportunities for such collaboration is at most of the times limited. Also, evidence regarding all these challenges is very scarce. So what happened through our SIB framework actually, and this cross-departmental collaboration, and have our colleagues from Ma'an here, Shamma, and I can see Pedro also. So what we did is we built this common understanding of what is exactly we want to address and how to define it and how to translate it into action actually and align our interests and goals. And so now through this SIB project, we have the opportunity to produce local data and facilitate data sharing among concerned partners. And this is a point that that was like mentioned several times, even by Daniel and Celeste here. So, and also we have an opportunity to build metrics for measuring outcomes and to engage in this adaptive learning to enhance performance and thereby enhance impact. And this goes beyond what traditional contracting could achieve in a context similar to ours. So again, we could have all the data that we want, we could collect the data that we need, but while data drives facts, it's actually the collaboration that generates value.
Thank you, Nancy. I think this collaboration is interestingly played out in your example because it's really between two government agencies, which is fascinating when you look at the data function and how that capacity sense-making plays out. Neil, can I come to you because I know you work in the UK where lots of this data and performance function is actually played by intermediaries or even social investors. Can you talk us through some of what we found and learned?
Yeah, it's very interesting. So in the UK, I think it's become clear that there are really two different models of performance management emerging. I suppose for 10 seconds, we would characterize performance management as being both the analysis and interpretation of project data. That's what Celeste was talking about earlier, internal project data predominantly. And then taking action on that data, either to improve performance further, whether it's already going well, or to address shortcomings if performance isn't going well. And it is very interesting the extent to which two dimensions in the original GoLab 4-dimension model and our slightly expanded 6-dimension model relate closely together. So one is the extent of additional performance management and who does that performance management, and the other is the extent to which risk is being taken by investors or directly by providers. So as Al said right at the start of this session, in particular on that risk dimension, you see a model where investors are taking all the risk, one where it's shared and one where you're getting closer to a PBR model. And what's become quite clear, I think, in the UK is that where you're closer to, you can then get emerging, and every SIB is different and everyone is on a different dimensions, but there are certainly two emerging models. One is where the provider is predominantly responsible for managing their own performance and analyzing data, but the investor or their representative, a fund manager or an intermediary, will be involved in supporting that process. And they will be involved in external challenge, in bringing in knowledge from other projects, in suggesting innovation and different ways to do things. And then when the investor or the fund manager is taking all or most of the risk, it is much more likely that they will be directly involved in managing the performance themselves, in bringing in their own data analysts and in driving that performance. What I think the two things that are interesting about that, one is that, as we said throughout, these are choices. There isn't a sense in which one is a good model, one is a bad model. And the choice is often driven by who the parties to that think are best to take the risk and best to manage the performance. And if those things are aligned correctly, they work well. There are some examples where they don't work so well, where they get out of whack. So if the investors are taking most of the risk, but most of the management is being put on the provider, then it's more likely that it won't quite work as well. But the other thing I think that's really important is that when SIBs was started, one of the things that was said is that we would get financial capital, that they would bring in finance. What's become increasingly clear, I've heard this from lots of people in the market in the last few years, is that investors and their representatives are not just bringing in financial capital, they're bringing in other types of capital, they're bringing in management capital, intellectual capital, knowledge capital. And in both those models that applies. It's just the extent to which it applies. So it's not a case of saying where the provider is doing the management, the investor is not involved, they're just involved in a different way, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Thank you so much. This issue of additional capital is really fascinating, but I'm not going to open up a whole debate about who plays the role of data and performance management, and therefore what it looks like and what are the costs. Andre jinxed me. I told you. Now we're running behind time. Yeah, people stare at me. All the evil's coming. Yep. So.
Questions in the chat, but I know at least for one of them, the person who's asked it is in the room, so perhaps over lunch.
Yeah, indeed. I was going to say we're going to skip Q&A here and move to the third leg. We're almost there, and it's about shared purpose. So I think a lot of us have alluded to it already about collaboration, breaking down silos, working in the same direction, etc. But what is actually specifically done to make sure that happens beyond, from your experience of working across Europe? Can you just very quickly talk us through some of the examples?
Sure, yeah. I mean, we started out in the Netherlands with now quite some impact bonds. It feels like we're a mature market, but I don't think we're mature in a lot of lessons that we've learned, but maybe not in the market itself. We're not trying to bring some of those lessons across different countries in Europe. I mean, I think one of the main lessons we've learned is that in many impact bonds that we started out with in the early days, where and it feels like some of these discussions are still here, is we're looking at how can we apply social outcomes contracts in impact bonds. And actually around that shared purpose, I think more and more as we come into new places, we come into with the question around social outcomes contracts. I think the first question we then ask that is, why do you want a social outcomes contract? And what is the actual purpose that we're around this table? And is a social outcomes contract the right method for that? I think you mentioned, like, in some cases the grant structure is much better. There are other places where procurement or public policy works fine. Like, we don't need it. So really align around the purpose, around the impact goals and the policy goals we're trying to achieve, rather than align around the ambition of a social outcomes contract, because I think that just comes second. And I think that the other aspect that I think has helped and we've grown in is thinking a little bit more sophisticated about which outcomes are we targeting. I think that came across a little bit earlier as well, where it doesn't always have to be those, objectively measured, fine, tick the box outcomes that feel very natural to a social outcomes contract. It's just easy to tick, and then we'll have an outcome payment. But can we align around, again, what are we trying to achieve? What is it? What are the outcomes that really matter for the people that we're trying to support through those services? And can we identify ways to find out what the program has done for them? And that might mean that we're measuring differently. That also might mean that it becomes a little more subjective in other means, but actually that's fine. So I think that's the other element. And I think the third and final one is where we try to, in many places where there's no like structural support, for instance, like in the UK, where there's been obviously a lot of outcomes funding available, is really designing it together. Right? I mean, is from the outset try to bring the different stakeholders in one group, and it doesn't always feel natural. And I think from an ideal perspective, you would have sort of like a tender procedure, or have like ways of selecting which organizations or which consortia are best. But and we've tried in many cases. There have been trials with that. But I think especially in areas where there's a need for new evidence base, need for market development, is really finding those key pioneers in the field in different areas and just do it together and get going, start doing, and then from there on, I think the rest will build.
Sure, great. I think this again resonates with points that other people have talked about, where the shared purpose doesn't just come from the outcomes of the projects that we're targeting. There are a wider range of objectives. So when we're talking about what's the purpose, what's a problem, it's not just a problem to be solved by the intervention itself, but there's a wider set of objectives around that. Could I come to colleagues from Italy? Because I think you're going about shared purpose, constructing that slightly differently. Filippo, could I start with you and maybe bring in Vincenzo quickly?
Yeah, sure. Our is definitely a story driven by the big purpose. It's actually, what do they call it, a political enterprise, very totally bottom up, purpose-driven, determined by the context. Let me explain briefly. So the big problem is the big transformation of the prison system. In Italy, you have a population of 60,000 people growing. Budget spent by government 3 billion a year, not sufficient, not very effective. The reoffending rate, I won't give you the figure, not even the ministry has the figure, is in any case obscene. And they don't want to measure it because it would be even worse. But there are many mushrooming projects about addressing this, and the approach is always the same. When the people are still serving the sentence, get them to do a job. Getting a job is a way, essentially, to start the social inclusion before they get out. There are a lot of micro projects, a lot of social enterprises and cooperatives. Coming from where we come, so the ecosystem approach, we said, okay, well, how do we turn those micro projects into something which is at scale, financially sustainable and long-term and structural? So the money that government might want to spend, especially with the next government, in building more prisons, they will go into program putting inmates into work. And by the way, in Italy, there is a policy, there is law, that allows prisoners still serving their sentence to work outside of the prison. Now, they have done it, especially in public work, but the big challenge is to get them to work in the private sector. So really a way out, and at the same time, a way to reduce the cost of government spending. So we put together a coalition. Kudos to Vincenzo, because we always talk about the government and the state, but at the end, there are some individuals who make the difference, and they are the ones, the civil servants inside of the state, that make this possible. What their colleagues are sitting, doing what they always do, but that's not only with the private sector, not public sector. And a developer, so a big business, we had actually an opportunity. Big developer, 5 billion development projects, big money. Next, a prison. Wow, we don't want a prison next to a 5 billion. So we use a grant to do a very little program of work inclusion of those prisoners in the construction of the site. Beautiful. But what we realized very quickly is that philanthropy has its own limits. So in order to scale up and use the government funding, we needed something else. Yeah, the use of the social impact bond. However, conditions. Italian government, Italian state does not have an impact investing framework, as especially not something built over 20 years as it happened in the UK. And so therefore it was totally bottom up. There was no understanding within the public service about this approach, this idea that you pay, essentially the state goes shopping for results. What is this? How can we do it? There are no rules to do that. And so we designed this using MAVA EIB, the European Investment Bank. And we use essentially the European Investment Bank as a validation. Besides the practical support, having that public body understanding about finance and the issue, but external from government, external from the administration, gave the validation, the reassurance also for civil servants to have someone not nasty or funny entrepreneurs like us, you never understand what they say. Those are serious people from the European Investment Bank. But it worked. And I see the function of those public bodies helping those coalition of entrepreneurs. Now, we have just finalized the feasibility study. So the first pilot is it's on 200 court for 3 years, 2.8 million total value. The target is actually 4,000 people. And we are talking about something almost 60 million. So that is the final goal. We pursued the investors, the private investors. We got the administrations to somehow to understand what we are doing. We have two main problems. Number one, how this public outcome payments mechanism fits into the current administration. Politics. We haven't talked about politics, but clearly I think politics is not a problem in Italy, but in Italy there is a change of government, so we have to start again. And finally, public sector is not still taking this seriously. So it works as a philanthropy, and for instance, Lend-Lease backed this as a philanthropic, but they still struggling to see this as a business case, and size matters.
Thanks, Filippo. I'm aware we haven't brought in Vincenzo. Vincenzo, are you still there? Or have you gone for tea?
Thank you.
Vincenzo, yes. Do you have anything to add very quickly, just very quickly to what Filippo had just said?
Yes, the initiative is great value for the public administration and for the Department of Penitentiary Administration in particular. The SOC is a unique opportunity to achieve a structured and organic transformation of our work inclusion of conving is design and management in the national territory and across multiple business sectors. I am optimistic that this can be achieved through the synergy with other institutions who we don't usually work, such as the Ministry of Digital Transition and the National Investment Bank. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincenzo. We've gone over time by 5 minutes. Really sorry about that. Poor chairing on my part. Apologies. There won't be any time for questions and answers in here, but do pick up the conversation in the coffee break. The coffee break lasts to what time?
Lunchtime.
Oh, was it lunchtime? God, we've talked from breakfast to lunch. Well, thank you, everyone, all the panelists, the wonderful team from the GoLab, the technicians and everyone. Thanks for staying.